Emma's return to Camp Willowbrook felt like a homecoming. She had spent her childhood summers there, making memories that would last a lifetime, surrounded by the lush, green woods and the steady, comforting sounds of nature. But now, years later, she came back not as a wide-eyed camper, but as an arts and crafts counselor, ready to help the next generation of kids create memories just like hers. The camp nestled deep in the heart of the forest, miles away from civilization. There were no bustling roads, no honking cars, just the stillness of nature, the scent of pine in the air, and the quiet hum of the world at peace. Or so she thought. When she arrived, the familiar sights, the old wooden cabins, the ropes course, the campfire ring should have filled her with joy. But instead, they stirred something deep inside her, an unease she couldn't explain. The woods felt heavy, like they were watching her. It wasn't supposed to be like this. It was supposed to be an escape from the noise, a retreat into a simpler time. But instead of comfort, all she felt was an almost suffocating silence, like the woods were holding their breath. As the first week passed, Emma's suspicions began to grow. Late at night, while the campers were asleep in their bunks, Emma would stay up late in the craft cabin, putting the final touches on her art projects. The flickering of the dim overhead light cast long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist, always lurking just out of sight. One evening, the wind kicked up, rattling the cabin's windows, sending a shiver down her spine. But then she heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the roof. At first, she dismissed it as the wind, or perhaps a squirrel scampering across the shingles. But the tapping grew more deliberate, more insistent, until it felt like something or someone was trying to get her attention. She stood frozen in the middle of the room, straining to hear the sound. Just a raccoon or something, she muttered to herself, trying to calm her nerves. But the tapping persisted, then shifted to something even more unnerving, a scrape, as if something was dragging across the roof, following the contours of the building. Emma's heartbeat quickened. When she finally ventured outside, she found nothing but the empty darkness of the woods. Still, her unease lingered, gnawing at her insides. But the next morning, things seemed normal again, and she chalked it up to an overactive imagination. She had always been prone to jump scares, even as a kid. That was until the flowers started appearing. The first one was small, a delicate bunch of wildflowers, tied together with an old, frayed string. It was left just outside the craft cabin, as though placed there intentionally. Emma assumed it was a sweet gesture from one of the campers, perhaps someone who had a crush on her or wanted to surprise her with a kind offering. But then, the flowers kept coming. More and more, every morning, there would be a new bouquet, sometimes tied with hairbands, other times with strange, tangled threads. They were always scattered around her cabin, in random places on the steps, beneath the windowsill, behind the porch railing. Each bouquet seemed more intricate, more unnerving than the last. The strings were sometimes wrapped in odd patterns, like they had been arranged with careful precision, almost as though someone was trying to tell her something. It wasn't long before Emma stopped believing it was a coincidence. The tapping continued, now accompanied by something darker, more menacing. The faint sound of laughter began to drift into the cabin at night, soft at first, almost like it was coming from a distance. But it wasn't friendly laughter, it was low, mocking, like someone was watching her and taking great pleasure in her discomfort. One night, as she worked late into the evening, the laughter echoed louder, closer. She froze, her hands trembling as she carefully placed the clay sculpture she had been working on down. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and her eyes darted to the window, expecting to see nothing but the usual empty blackness. But this time, something was different. Through the dim light filtering in from the cabin, she saw them, two eyes. They glowed in the darkness, shining like pale orbs reflecting the light from inside. They were wide open, unblinking, and stared directly into her soul. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she stared back, her heart hammering in her chest. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body was frozen in terror. Then, the laughter came again, louder this time, and the eyes blinked. Slowly. They never left her gaze. Emma scrambled for the door, her mind racing as she grabbed a staff left by one of the campers for self-defense. She flung open the door and charged out into the night, her heart pounding as she raced toward the trees. But when she reached the spot where the eyes had been, there was nothing. The woods stood silent, the figure vanishing as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the shadows. Emma didn't sleep much that night, too afraid to close her eyes, too terrified to think about what she had seen. The next day, when she opened the door to her cabin, a smell hit her, a thick, rancid odor that made her stomach turn. She stepped back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle the nausea. There, curled up in the corner of the room, was a rattlesnake, its body coiled in a deadly circle, its eyes gleaming with malice. Emma's blood ran cold. How had it gotten inside? Why hadn't she heard it? Her mind spun with terror, and she couldn't help but feel it was no accident. The snake wasn't just a random creature, it was a warning. Someone or something was sending her a message. In a panic, Emma threw the snake out and shut the door, trying to push away the feeling that the woods themselves were alive, watching her every move. But the flowers kept coming. Every day, they appeared in new places, always arranged carefully, always tied with strings. She tried to ignore them, but deep down, she knew. Whoever was leaving them wasn't just trying to make her nervous, they were playing a game. A very dangerous game. On the last day of camp, Emma walked toward the ridge, her mind consumed by the events that had transpired. She wanted answers, wanted to understand why this was happening. And then, she saw him. The figure stood tall and still on the ridge, watching her from a distance, his face hidden in shadow. His laughter echoed down the hill, dark and mocking, carrying through the cold air like a bad omen. "You can't escape," he called, his voice laced with cruel amusement. "Not from me. Not from here." Fear surged in Emma's chest as she turned and ran, her footsteps pounding against the dirt path as she made her way to the director's cabin. She burst through the door, gasping for breath, desperate to explain what had been happening. The director listened, his face growing pale as Emma recounted the events. A police investigation was launched, but no trace of the man could be found. There were no footprints, no evidence of trespassing, just the same empty woods that had always been there. As the camp closed for the season, Emma left. But she could never shake the feeling that something, or someone, had been watching her from the shadows. The flowers, the tapping, the laughter, they haunted her long after she left Camp Willowbrook behind. Years later, she would return to the area, only to find that the camp had been abandoned. No longer a retreat for children, it was now just a forgotten place, swallowed by the woods. Emma would never return. She couldn't. Because deep down, she knew the woods weren't done with her yet. They were still waiting, watching, always watching. There was always something magnetic about Jake, Zach's older brother. He had that kind of presence that made you feel like he existed in a realm beyond ours, untouchable, almost godlike. He didn't need to try, he simply was. Jake was the kind of guy who didn't need to say much to make everyone listen. He was confident, fearless, with a laugh that could fill an entire room. To Zach and me, he was a hero, a symbol of everything we wanted to be when we grew up. But, more than that, Jake had the freedom we could only dream of. I spent most of my summer at Zach's house, always tagging along, trying to soak in whatever wisdom Jake was willing to share, even though I knew he didn't really see me. His world was a separate, impenetrable universe. The three of us spent hours in the backyard or on the front porch, talking about trivial things, what we were going to do when we were older, where we would go to college, which sports we would play, but all the while, Jake held the reins, guiding our dreams without even knowing it. That summer, things changed. Jake announced he would be leaving for an adventure camp. It was a big deal, something that would make him even more legendary in our eyes. Zach and I were left behind in the dust, clinging to the idea that maybe, just maybe, we'd get to go next year. But even in the comfort of the house, I could feel the tension between us. Jake was embarking on a journey we could only imagine. It was a rite of passage, and we were still just kids, stuck on the outside, watching him move farther away from us. Next year, Zach said quietly, his voice thick with longing, but his eyes betrayed him. He knew, just as I did, that the future seemed out of reach. We could talk about going to that camp all we wanted, but there was something in the way Jake spoke, the way he carried himself, something that said we could never quite catch up to him. The summer days stretched on without him, long and dull. The absence of Jake was like a hole in the air, one that couldn't be filled. It was as if the house had sighed with relief, and everything, even the trees outside, seemed to hold their breath in anticipation. The moments when we would gather in the living room felt empty, the energy drained out of us without him. Then, the phone call came. Jake was finally returning home. Jake's return wasn't the triumphant, joyous occasion I had imagined. He arrived late one evening, and it was clear from the moment he stepped through the door that something had shifted. The usual boisterous greeting was missing. Zach and I were sitting in the living room, flipping through magazines, when we heard the front door creak open. But it wasn't the sound of his voice that greeted us, it was just a soft, eerie rustle, followed by a gentle tap on the window from the outside. I looked up. There was Jake standing on the porch, his face obscured by shadows, his figure outlined by the dim light outside. His posture was stiff, unnatural. I could hear the faint sound of his laughter, but it wasn't the familiar, carefree laugh we had known all our lives. It was forced. Hollow. Like a laugh that had been practiced, something rehearsed rather than genuine. My stomach twisted with unease. Jake. I called out, but the response was too delayed, too strange. The laugh that followed seemed to echo in my head, as if it reverberated in the walls themselves. That night, sleep didn't come easy. I tossed and turned, tangled in my own restless thoughts, until exhaustion finally dragged me into an uneasy sleep. And then, in the middle of the night, I had a dream. In the dream, Jake never came home. He was lost in the wilderness, alone and forgotten, his voice barely a whisper on the wind. His laughter echoed, hollow and distorted, until it grew louder and louder, turning into something dark, something that felt more like a warning than a welcome. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest, unable to shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. The dream didn't make sense, but I knew deep down that it wasn't just a dream, it was a vision. A glimpse of something I couldn't explain. The strange behavior didn't end with Jake's return. It got worse. One night, I was sitting in Zach's room, chatting, trying to ignore the unsettled feeling creeping up on me, when the sounds began. Soft footsteps echoed down the hallway, too quiet to be anyone else's. I looked at Zach, but his eyes were wide, already searching the shadows. Then we saw him, Jake, sleepwalking, his movements jerky and disjointed. His eyes were shut, his face expressionless. His body moved as if it wasn't entirely his own, like some unseen force was pulling him along. Jake. I whispered. But Jake didn't respond. He was too far gone, lost in whatever trance had overtaken him. He walked into the living room, stood motionless for a moment, then turned and began to walk again, as though he was retracing steps from a memory that wasn't his. His mumbling was low and indecipherable, but I caught a few words. It's fine. I'm fine, new thing, picked it up at camp. Sleepwalking. From camp? This wasn't like Jake at all. He had never done this before, and yet here he was, moving like a marionette with no strings, as if something inside him had changed. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had followed Jake home from that camp wasn't just a sleepwalking habit. It was something darker, something much worse. I stood frozen, too terrified to move, watching him shuffle aimlessly, his eyes closed, his lips twisted in a strange, unsettling half-smile. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he stopped and turned back to his room, the trance lifting as abruptly as it had come. When he was gone, Zach and I sat in the dark, unsure of what to do. I wanted to say something, to ask him what was going on, but I knew it wouldn't do any good. Jake was different now. The camp hadn't just changed him, it had broken something inside him, something that would never be repaired. Years later, I found myself sitting in the living room of Zach's house once again. The air was thick with nostalgia and unease. The memories of Jake's strange behavior and the unspoken dread that had followed him home were still fresh in my mind. But it wasn't until that night, when Zach casually mentioned Matt, that everything began to fall into place. "Do you remember Matt?" Zach asked, his voice hesitant. "The camp counselor?" Turns out, after the camp, they found out some disturbing things about him. My heart skipped a beat. I'd heard rumors, whispers about Matt in the years following that summer, but I had never wanted to know the truth. It wasn't until that moment that the puzzle pieces started to connect in my mind. "Matt," Zach continued, his voice barely audible, "he'd been doing things with the kids. They didn't tell anyone until later. It was all covered up, kept quiet. But my mom, she warned me about him. She said he was dangerous." I felt a coldness settle over me, creeping through my bones. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I had never put two and two together until now. Jake hadn't just come back from camp with a new habit, he had brought something darker back with him. Matt had been involved in something sinister, something far more insidious than just a prank or a few harmless games. He had infected the camp, and now Jake was a casualty of that twisted world. I had spent years wondering what had happened to Jake, why he had changed so drastically, but now I knew the truth. The danger had been there all along, hidden in plain sight, lurking in the shadows. And we had been too naive to see it. As the night wore on, I realized something: instincts were often the only thing we had to rely on. They were the only defense against the unseen, the things that linger just out of reach. And sometimes, those things followed you home. The camp had claimed more than just Jake's innocence, it had come for all of us.